Well, hello, everybody. We're going to get off with our first event of the Festival of Urbanism this year, Net Zero Urban Features. I'm Carl Grodock, Professor and Director of Monash Urban Planning and Design. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation, traditional owners of the land and waters where I speak from today and where Monash operates. I pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to elders from wherever you may be joining us from online today. This is the 9th annual Festival of Urbanism. We have over 20 free events running through September 23rd, so you can go online and check that out. A huge array of speakers and panel discussions, film events, and walking tours. Really cool collection of things this year. And I also just want to say that the festival is co-sponsored by University of Sydney Henry Halloran Research Trust and Monash Urban Planning and Design. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our panel, Rob Robin, and here you go. Thanks.
Thank you, Carl, and hello, welcome everyone. Also on my behalf, my name is Rob Raven or Rob Robin, depending on which pronunciation you prefer. I'm a professor of sustainability transitions at Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and I will be chairing the panel today. And bear with me, you've got a bit of an introduction, and then hand over to the people next to me. Before we begin, I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I speak from today, the Wiradjuri people and the Kulin Nation. I also pay my respect to the elders present, past, and emerging, as well as the traditional owners of the land from wherever you may be coming from. I'm also welcome to people online. So the 9th Festival of Urbanism asks how our future cities and regions will change and what interventions are needed to address the mistakes of the past. And I think that the current panel and the topic that we will be discussing today fits this ambition extremely well. So I'm very pleased to chair the current panel, which carries the rather exciting and perhaps somewhat cryptic title, Net Zero Urban Futures, Hype, Hope, or Reality. So what does this mean? Following the Paris Agreement to reduce carbon emissions, net zero is quickly becoming a bit of a buzzword in policy and business circles. We've seen many governments and organizations make net zero pledges ever since. One example is the most recently accepted climate change bill by the Australian government, which puts into law a net zero ambition and a 43% ambition by 2030. In a nutshell, net zero refers to principles that we can achieve zero emissions through a combination of different things. So, for instance, reducing emissions through efficiency improvements, through new solutions such as renewable energy, offsetting carbon emissions by reducing emissions elsewhere, or even through active capturing of emissions from the atmosphere, for instance, through reforestation or carbon capture. So why is that important? Well, we know that carbon emissions are a major source of climate change and the effects of that. So droughts, floodings, increased bushfire risks, and climate change associated health risks. So why, and perhaps even more important, how should we talk about climate change in the context of the Festival of Urbanism? Arguably, cities are key areas where the effects of climate change are felt. First, through the urban heat island effects, which means that cities tend to be warmer than other areas because of the way they are built. Cities are also where more than half of the world population lives, and this is expected to keep growing to about 3/4 of the global population. And according, well, as such, cities and urban dwellers are a major source of carbon emissions, for instance, through the way we travel and live and consume. According to the United Nations, cities consume 78% of world energy and produce more than 60% of the carbon emissions. Yet cities account for less than 2% of the Earth's surface. So all this tells us that cities and our urban lifestyles are core to climate change problems and vulnerable to its effects. However, cities are also recognized as places of creativity, innovation, and change. Many city governments have already committed to reducing emissions. In Victoria, for instance, we've got at least 21 councils that have submitted pledges to reduce emissions. Europe, as ambitious as always, has a mission to make 100 cities carbon neutral by 2030. And these are massive ambitions. And urban innovation and transformation is often seen as a solution or even as a panacea to get us out of this situation. We need to drastically change our cities and urban lifestyles to achieve net zero emissions. However, I would argue major challenges obviously remain to deliver on these pledges. And one of the key challenges, I think, is that we need to find new ways of thinking, talking, innovating, and collaborating to solve the issues of climate change. I always need to paraphrase a famous person, so in this case, I'm going to paraphrase Albert Einstein. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. We all know this, but nevertheless, narratives around net zero urban futures continue to be expressed often in rather technological terms. If we switch to electric vehicles and have solar panels installed, then we achieve net zero futures. So the argument goes. Yet we know that that sort of technological determinism, which is the assumption or narrative technologies are the primary cause of the future, is not the way futures actually unfold. The relationship between technological change and societal change is much more complex, multifaceted, non-linear, and full of surprises and unexpected or unintended consequences. So we need to find new ways to work with and within this complexity and find new narratives to navigate that complexity. We need to recognize that future-oriented work and innovation comes about through novel framings, new ways of collaboration and participation, social innovation and transformation, and cultural and institutional change, all of which co-evolve with technological change. And this also involves new narratives about the everyday life of people, how we live, how we work, travel and play, and how this will enable, or Sarah's words complicates net zero urban futures. So these kind of questions and topics are core to a recently funded Australian Research Council project on net zero precincts, which is also underpinning the current discussions and panel composition of today. And this project involves a broad collaboration between Monash University, our industry partner ANGI, Monash Council, and a range of other partners from the knowledge industry and public sectors. So I'm very pleased that today we have a number of panelists here that can help us explore that important question if net zero urban futures are a hype, a hope, or a reality. So I'll first introduce the panelists. I'll start with Trish, second from the left, from your right. And every panelist will give a brief, around 5-minute introduction on their views on this particular topic. And after the panelists, we have Q&A and we go into a moderated discussion. So first panelist, Dr. Trish McGee. Trish is a sustainability coordinator at the City of Monash. She's led the Monash Council sustainability team since 2016 and is delivering on the key priorities of the Environmental Sustainability Strategy 2010-2026 for the City of Monash. Yeah, just watch back the recording. So the most recent success for Trish was working with Council to achieve a zero net carbon corporate strategy by 2025 and the endorsement of a zero net carbon action plan to guide delivery for this and supporting the community in a low carbon future. So Trish, the floor is yours for the 5-minute pitch.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, everyone. I suppose we're sort of hoping for the reality side of things. Back in 2020, Council committed to going carbon neutral by 2025, which seems quite ambitious, but it was something that we wanted to move forward with. We did, it wasn't just a normal political target saying, yes, let's do it. There was a fair bit of analysis done and worked out that based on the actions that we wanted to propose, we could do it like cost neutral by 2028, but then the council got a little bit ambitious and wanted to do it by 2025, which is great. One of the things that helped with us, I suppose the confidence in giving us that target was the fact that we collaborated with 46 other councils on the It's a power purchase agreement, so called VECO, the Victorian Energy Collaboration. And that enabled us to actually purchase 100% renewable electricity for all our sites from July 2021. So that was a great way for us to jump forward. And it meant that we were able to reduce our emissions by up to 60%, overnight, effectively, our net emissions anyway. And then we had a number of other key projects that we've been, I suppose, working on and working towards, such as upgrading our major facilities and our major public lighting. So we had a number of projects that we knew we were going to get there. We will probably have to still look at purchasing offsets from 2025 to meet our target. But, based on our corporate target, we're feeling pretty confident. One of the challenges is the city of Monash. I don't know if many people of you know, but we're out in the east, between some freeways, but about 200,000 people live there and make that their home. And it's also the largest employer outside of the CBD, and possibly the largest now because nobody's going to the CBD. But it's, so, and we also have quite a number of head offices and a lot of manufacturing. So in terms of emissions, on a municipal level, it's quite significant. I think it's one of the 6th highest in the area. And that means that while we can get to net zero for corporate emissions, that's only actually 1% of the total municipality. We're not talking about a large space, a large area. So it means, and because we are local government, we do have some responsibility over that area. So we need to look, as part of our action plan, we also looked at what things we could do to help the community and to help our businesses move forward. And so we've got some programs that relate to supporting them to help them reduce emissions, like Solar Savers program and Business Energy Saver. We're also looking at how we can, one of the significant things that we were doing is we manage waste. Waste is a significant generation of emissions, so people sometimes forget that. And by delivering on our food organics in the green bin program, that's effectively reducing another possible 1% of emissions for our region. So it's quite a significant project. But we also need to look at how we can, offset our emissions, and also, we have a lot of programs that we're looking towards to help build our canopy cover either in Monash and maybe working with other councils to help move that forward. But I suppose that the biggest challenge is there's some things we can do, we can facilitate, there's some projects that we can lead, there's some that we just have to provide advice on, but we often can't do this alone. And so for example, with VECO, we work with 46 other councils. We work together with the Eastern Alliance for Greenhouse Action, which is a collaboration of 8 councils, and that helps us deliver a lot of our programs, and even partnerships with the Monash University Precinct Program. We need those sort of things to help inform and influence how we move forward to hopefully make it a reality. That's all for me for now.
Thank you, Trish. That was really a good starting point to understand some of these issues and struggles that you are trying to resolve in novel ways in the Monash Council in this case. So this second panelist is Dr. Darren Sharp, for me, from the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. And Darren is a research fellow, a senior research fellow, and a sustainability transition scholar interested in things like urban experimentation, living labs, grassroots innovation, and the sharing economy. He's interdisciplinary research lead of the Monash Energy Alliance and the ASC Linkage project on Net Zero, and an ASC Linkage project on Net Zero Precincts, which brings together transition management and design anthropology to pioneer a new approach to transitioning cities to net zero. Darren, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much for that, Rob, and thanks to Carl and the organisers of the festival. It's great to be able to kick it off here at MARTA at Monash Caulfield and to be with my fellow panelists. It's wonderful to see the Linkage project. We're about a year in now, and it's a great opportunity today during the panel to be able to report back on some of the preliminary findings that are emerging. In terms of my work, it's really focused on, as Rob alluded to, urban experimentation, understanding how different actors, whether academic, industry, government, community actors, come together to trial alternative city futures, multi-stakeholder governance, new modes of sustainable urban development, and so on. In the context of the linkage and net zero, I'm really interested in understanding the role that stories play, visions of the future. What net zero stories do we live by as a community? It's going to be different for everybody, and we're finding that in the interviews that have been undertaken to date. We've had over 50 interviews with members of the precinct community, a combination of Monash staff and students, local government, state government, SMEs, corporate actors, members of the community and others. So I wanted to report back on some of those emerging findings and talk about it in terms of some frames, net zero frames, and narratives of change, narratives of place that are emerging, which I think can be quite instructive and illuminating. And I think it's probably a combination in terms of our topic title. It's a combination of hope and reality. I don't think it's any one or the other. In terms of the project itself, it's a 4-year project. We're really piggybacking off of the great work that's been done through the Net Zero initiative, which was launched in 2017, where Monash has a net zero target by 2030 and is undertaking a range of infrastructural transformations across our 4 domestic campuses, everything from renewable energy on site, a power purchase agreement with the renewable energy wind farm in regional Victoria, building upgrades, LEDs, removing gas appliances, a microgrid with a 1 megawatt battery, and offsetting and so on. So we're using that as an opportunity to see how can we take advantage of the Monash Clayton campus, specifically the broader Monash Technology Precinct within which we're situated, as a living lab, as a collaborative arena to come together with partners. In this case, we're very lucky and privileged to have partners like the City of Monash, and I'm grateful to Trish for being here today, Angie, CSIRO, ICLEI, and others who are partnering with us to try and understand how can we scale the ambition that we have as a university to get to net zero beyond the footprint of the campus to a broader technology precinct, and what are the governance challenges, tensions, uncertainties, and so on, and how you do that with partners, and what does that look like? So in terms of some emerging insights from stage 1, as I mentioned, I've done about 25 interviews with front runners, my staff and students, and so on, the other actors I mentioned, to get a sense of how they are perceiving the net zero precinct, the frames, the stories they tell about it, the uncertainties, the drivers and barriers to net zero. So we know that net zero has become a critical goal for urban transformation. Cities are a canvas on which to dream about the future, project our hopes, our fears, our politics, our modes of governance, policies of economic development, and so on. Given cities have become critical arenas to undertake experiments in urban transformation, it's important to ask the question, what are cities transforming into? Net zero structures the context for urban transformation by framing visions and stories of the city that determine which actors get to play a role in driving transformative change and prioritize certain practices over others. So from transition studies, we know that framing is an important process that uses problem structuring, visioning, articulating expectations, storytelling, and narrating as strategic devices to orient and steer actors towards the desirable change trajectory. So according to transition scholars, narratives of change can have material consequence by working to reframe the action space of urban transformation and create opportunities to challenge dominant framings and institutions. Narratives of place, a related concept, can mobilize action, can engender new opportunity contexts, new social relations, new webs of meaning between actors undertaking local experiments. So in the Net Zero Precincts project, we're defining framing as processes that situate experimentation in particular ways by using stories and visions to foreground set problems and propose specific actors, solutions, logics, or governance approaches in an attempt to influence the scope or direction of transformative pathways. So in the context of our project, we're interested in understanding how a range of those frontrunners, these actors, can frame net zero transformation of the Monash Clayton campus, of the broader technology precinct, in terms of understanding the main sustainability challenges as they see it, their future visions, what they see as the drivers and barriers of change, along with seeds of innovation. So from the preliminary analysis, which is emerging from these interviews, we've identified at least 4 frames of the Monash Net Zero Precinct, which I want to just run quickly past you. So the first of these is electrify everything. This frame focuses on market-based technology development to achieve carbon emissions reductions. This could be everything from energy providers taking on more responsibility for microgrids, providing infrastructure that enables behaviour change, actively engaging with business in the precinct and guiding them to net zero, making net zero visible and tangible. The second frame is what we're calling place matters, which attends to concerns related to livability, mobility, inclusivity, sociality, and amenity. This is really foregrounding how people live, work, and socialise locally in the precincts. It's about involving traditional owners more in decision-making. It's about providing more active transport options and improved bicycle infrastructure, and generally improving connectivity and walkability in the precinct. The third frame we call Going Green, which embraces circular economy principles, nature-based solutions, and green infrastructures. Some of the ideas that have come up through this idea include green roofs, walls, and facades, a desire to reduce the urban heat island effect, closed-loop circular economy ideas around food production, waste utilisation at the Clayton campus and broader precincts, a more diverse range of land uses and water-sensitive urban design, and a desire for more open green space. And the fourth frame of net zero that we're seeing in the project is what we're calling innovation hotspot, which emphasises the potential of the precinct to become a major geographical agglomeration for net zero entrepreneurship, industry development, job creation, international recognition, and connectivity. So what I would argue is that if 4 frames have emerged from interviews with only 25 people at Monash Clayton campus in the precinct, suggest that further input from a wider and more diverse range of participants is likely to surface a multiplicity of frames of net zero to consider. So we're interested in understanding how net zero frames and stories affect the governance of urban transitions by conveying a sense of purpose, meaning making, and as a medium to communicate overlapping and sometimes competing narratives. Frames are important in generating a deeper understanding of what shapes possibilities, as well as tensions in accelerating a net zero precinct transition, because each frame prioritises and enables certain transition strategies, pathways, and collaborations, while at the same time obscuring other possibilities. Urban actors can also reframe dominant narratives of net zero transformation and put forward alternative frames, stories, and visions to reorient the scope of possible city futures, the range of actors who get to play a role, and the choice of actions to drive transformative change. These 4 distinct but related net zero frames point towards a challenge in balancing the desire for a clear and shared framing about the future to guide planning, directionality, investment, and action, versus keeping multiple pathways open in light of navigating complex governance realities and future uncertainties. So thanks very much. I'll end there and I'll pass back to Rob.
Thank you, Darren. That was really insightful and interesting to see you can learn so much from those interviews so far. So it's really great to be able to look forward, and we still have a number of years to go in the project, so I'll be able to learn a lot more from that. So I'm very pleased to have here also Professor Sarah Pink. Sarah is the Director of the Emerging Technologies Research Lab at Monash University, just the one building that way, I believe, or that way. Sarah's lab undertakes critical interdisciplinary and international research into the social, cultural, and experiential dimensions of the design, use, and futures of new and emerging technologies. Her research focuses on emerging intelligent technologies, automation, data, digital futures, safety, and design for well-being. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Rob. And yeah, likewise for me, I'm really delighted to be speaking at this Festival of Urban Future Urbanism. I was going to say urban futurism. That kind of gives me a segue into what I do, because a lot of my work is around what I call design anthropology and futures anthropology. And I think that focusing here on futures is just so absolutely important. And my work involves creating new, plausible, and realistic ways to work towards what I call trusted and hopeful futures. And again, also for me, I think the hype, the hope, and the reality are really core to the work that I do, because the hype, which is represented in the dominant narratives, is so problematic, right? The hope is fundamental for me. Hope comes from the everyday, and I'll speak about that a bit more in a minute. And the reality is just, it's so important to start thinking around how do we actually constitute and imagine futures that are actually realistic, that are actually plausible? How do we gain the understandings of the real everyday situations from which those futures can emerge? And I would be arguing that a turn to the everyday as a kind of a life source of the generation of any of the futures that we could potentially experience is absolutely fundamental. If we want the futures that we imagine from the present to be plausible and to be realistic. So turning to this, we are really at a moment, right, where we're being urged to consider ourselves to be at a moment of crisis or a pivotal moment from which we must make change. I'm not quite sure that thinking of ourselves as being in crisis from which we can then render a solution is necessarily the best way to think about this situation, but I'll mention that again in a minute. But what I want to say is that we do need to think ourselves at a moment from which we really need to consider and to develop new tools for working towards net zero. We need new interdisciplinary alignment. We need new multi-stakeholder alignment. We need to all work together as an enormous team, which of course is an incredibly complex proposition. And we've talked, I think what's been interesting that Darren has mentioned, the need for for framings, to think about framings and think of new framings that will take us forward to net zero. And I think that's one, I think it's really important to start to argue that we need to think about, we need to change the way in which we kind of conceptualize the routes forward to net zero. But the other thing I want to emphasize that we also need is another radical change, which is actually in how futures themselves and the routes towards net zero are understood and conceptualized. So we might think about the tools and the phrase users need to be revised, but I think we also need to think about, we need to consider how we understand futures and how we actually theorize and conceptualize and put into practical action the processes through which futures come about. And there's also an ethics to that, which I'll talk to in a second. My point there is also, if existing approaches worked, well, we would already be there. We would know very clearly what our route ahead is. Okay, so that for me is the core message, one of the very core messages. As other people have been saying, I'll just reiterate, we should not be repeating what we've been doing before. We shouldn't be using the same methods. We shouldn't be using the same concepts, the same theories. We need to renew those. And for me, rather than thinking that we're in a crisis, we need a solution, I think what we need to think about is that we're in a moment in which we can be generative. We're in a moment in which we can actually constitute new forms of hope. And those new forms of hope, which are generated from realistic and plausible ways forward, can enable us to really work towards a future trusted everyday context, a trusted future in which net zero becomes a reality, but becomes a way of life, rather than an endpoint, rather than a goal we're working towards from above. And that takes me to another point, which is meant to be a bit provocative, because I think I'm exaggerating, but it's good to exaggerate to get the point across, because I think there's a certain arrogance in some of the existing concepts and plans towards net zero. So approaches like behavior change, assuming that we could change people's behaviors to make net zero happen, assuming that providing EVs, electric vehicles, will change people's behavior and make net zero happen. It's a good example. We have mention of EVs, and there's a whole big story around those we could discuss for hours, I think, of this panel. But also the arrogance that you can get social license to do change to people. So, in creating behavior change is one kind of more individualized way of being arrogant about what you can get people to do, right? Asking for social license so communities will enable you to push forward the change that you think should happen is another form of arrogance, I think, in the application of it at a more community level. So I really want us to consider how we might abandon those concepts because they don't account for people's values. They don't account for the complexities or the contingencies of their lives. Rob was talking a little bit about how things never really turn out as we thought they would, because those complexities, those contingencies, those complications always shift the way that change happens. And that is very often those generative modes of change that come from real everyday life. So rather than thinking of them as barriers or limitations or things that upset the process of change, why don't we turn it around to consider them the kind of innovation that happens at ground level to be the source and the life source of future net zero. Let's stop thinking about change as something that we measure retrospectively as having happened, and change as something that's ongoing and experiential and generative, and also hard to control. So for me, the challenge is really to create these new approaches, and also to remind ourselves that if we approach any kind of change from the everyday, it's much likely to be much more inclusive. There's something very colonizing about approach to change from above, right? So how do we switch that? But how do we also switch it to make change inclusive, so that we start in the everyday world where people are diverse, okay? And then we work with their values and create ways forward with them. And I think that if we work at that level and consider that our way forward, we can actually put hope and trust at the center of our agenda. Hope and trust are two future-facing concepts that I use a lot. For me, trust is about the near future, and hope is about the further future. Trust is about how we sit, where we are now. We're in this moment, which I call the edge of the future. We're living our lives at the edge of the future, and we're going to step over to what's next. We're going to leave this present moment in the past as soon as it's happened. But how do we move over into that future in a way that we feel familiar, comfortable, in which we trust? And if we can do that with net zero, then we'll get to net zero, right? And how can we actually hope in the everyday as well? How can we have that feeling of a generative, farther future, imaginary, in which we feel invested as we go forward? How can we actually imagine a future and live towards a future in hope? So I know some of my concepts are a bit abstract and they might sound a bit vague, but we can make them a bit more concrete in the discussion, I hope. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Sarah. There was a lot in your comments. And we'll need to unpack some of that as we move forward with the discussions. Thanks for those contributions. And first, I want to give the last but not least 5 minutes to Margot de la Farouze. I should have pronounced that right, but please correct me. Who is the city system lead at Climate Work Center, which is part of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. The city's team aims to catalyze system-level transitions to net zero emissions in the urban environment. Margot also oversees the center's transport, buildings, and infrastructure programs. She's been driving change in the environment and climate space for nearly a decade, with experiences spanning across research, consulting, policy, and advocacy. Prior to joining Climate Works, Margot worked as head of sustainable cities for WWF in France, leading advocacy campaigns and programs on sustainable cities, buildings, and transport. Margot, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rob. So I'm realizing now my points might come either as complementary or a counterpoint to Sarah. Having a background in policy, it might sound a bit top down or arrogant. I don't know, hopefully not arrogant. I guess I'll take a point that I think I agree a lot more effort is needed in building up community-based approaches. But I also think that policy has a massive role in achieving those net zero cities. And I actually, in Australia in particular, see a big effort that could be done in further bridging the, I guess, gap between local climate leadership, which I think Trish on my right really embodies very well, and what's being done at federal and state level. So with that introduction, I just wanted to go back to the what are we talking about when we're talking about net zero cities? And I think it's important to note that if you put, I guess, some cities have a fairly big industrial carbon footprint, but the major things really are about transport and buildings emissions. These are the two main sources that we're trying to tackle if we're going to get to net zero cities. Now, the good thing is achieving net zero in those sectors, it's also about a more pleasant future, a healthier future for everyone. We're talking about more comfortable homes, healthier homes, if they're more energy efficient and powered on renewable energies. We're also talking about more efficient, pleasant, enjoyable ways to move around, cycling or walking, or even taking public transport rather than getting stuck in traffic. So that's why I'm so passionate about those things about net zero cities and those net zero futures. It's because it's not such a new thing. It's going back also to things that are quite essential and just make for happier, healthier living. So that's, but the reality that we're dealing with is that 20% of Australia's carbon footprint is transport and 20% of it is buildings, and this is massively concentrated in cities. So that's the reality piece that we're really trying to tackle. Now to the hope, and certainly my hope, if you take the 10 biggest metropolitan areas in Australia, so I'm really talking about metropolitan scale, and you add up all the emissions of these 10 metropolitan areas, this covers more than half of Australia's emissions. So if by 2035, we're able to get those to net zero, and I'm talking about community emissions, not just the corporate emissions, we're tackling a big chunk of the issue here. So getting that movement that local councils have been really driving and getting it all the way up to the top is going to be really important, and certainly something that I think we can achieve. Importantly, those 10 biggest metropolitan areas would also cover more than 70% of the population in Australia. So you're offering a healthier future to a lot of the people in this country. But the issue, as I think Darren, you hinted on, is the scale and the pace that we need to achieve this. And this is where I'm going back to policy, where as much as I would love the changes that we need to be driven by people, I firmly do not think that we can rely on consumers and people to drive the scale and the pace of change that we need. I think we need both, and I certainly would not undermine the efforts. I've been myself a vegetarian for 10 years. I ride my bike. I live, fairly sober, I think, life, but I'm not going to change the world by adding Margos to this world. I think we need structural system level changes. And so I'll give you a good example of this. One of the key areas in which my team focuses is buildings. I think probably a lot of you live in Melbourne. You probably live in really cold, inefficient homes and have been freezing for the past 3 months. I'm sure a lot of you would love to have a really, really well insulated home, very comfortable, not have to wear Uggs or have a heating blanket under your dinner cover. But the reality is that the system doesn't require the construction industry to deliver those homes. The policy isn't there. And so unless we get those changes that need to come from, and in this case, state and national policy, we won't get the pace and normalize the changes that we need. Good news is, in this particular example, 2 weeks ago, the buildings ministers agreed on upgrading the standards, but it's not yet, the end of the game. We need to go a lot further. So I guess with that, I'm again going back to the hope and maybe the hype now. I agree with the fact that net zero cities, or net zero can sound a bit technical, and what really we need to do is make this a narrative and a lifestyle. As you said, Sarah, I think everyone needs to embrace it, but I also think that we need really strong systemic policy changes and institutional changes, and we need the federal government and state government to really work more hand in hand with local government to enable all these really leading, forefront leading actions that we're seeing. I think there's a window of opportunity with the new government. They have, announced a cities and suburbs agenda. Doesn't yet draw a big link to climate. So I think there's the opportunity there to build in that narrative that the cities and suburbs agenda should be a climate agenda. They just legislated a climate target. This is the opportunity to get it implemented. And there's lots of things that need to be done, whether it's in buildings policy or transport investment. So I'll just close with that. I think there is probably no single or easy answer. And it's probably going to be, I guess, a mix of top down and bottom up. But I would argue that we can expect a lot from governments and hold them to account to deliver on this agenda.
Thanks a lot from Margot for that intervention. I think that was a really, really powerful one as well. And restating the importance of policies and structural systems change. That's part of the narrative that when we talk about and think about the future. I think this has given us a lot of ground for conversation. So we'll start the conversation now, open up, but also feel free to jump in. So if you have any questions, comments you would like to raise both in the room or online, and I'll switch to online as well. We're really happy to make this an open conversation and get your input in here as well. So I guess maybe just to get started, I think one of the points that stood out for me in listening to all of your comments was that when you talked about net zero, many of you started to talk about other things as well. Right? In the way net zero could be understood as a rather narrow concept. It's about emissions and getting to zero, which maybe is not the most attractive narrative about the future. We talked about riding our bikes, comfortable homes, getting more trees in the council, becoming an innovation hotspot, talking about everyday life and experiences. So all of this somehow needs to be accommodated when we think about the future and trying to deal with this challenge on climate change. My question to all of you is, and feel free to jump in when you can, is the language of net zero futures actually useful in that, or is it perhaps a narrowing concept that we should rather not, that we should get beyond because it might be too limiting? I really have for anyone to take up that question.
I could make a start, which is not a very technical point, but I think it's a really difficult concept for people to understand, actually, to unpack actually in your head when you're presented with this term net zero. But on the other hand, I think it's quite a catchy term, and that once people do understand it, then it takes on a life of its own. In terms of what it encompasses, if you think of it and as really being, about emissions, then of course it's much too narrow. But should we think about it necessarily as being about emissions, or should we use it as a container through which to actually conceptualize what I would call trusted and hopeful futures, and trusted and hopeful on a whole range of levels? Because if we do reduce emissions to zero, then that gives us hope for the climate, right? If we reduce emissions to zero, then it becomes a platform, if you like, an infrastructure, a conceptual infrastructure upon which we can then build our other hopes and our other wishes for the future. So in that sense, I think it actually works really well if we do the right thing with it and we engage the term in a really productive and generative way, because it does really sound good.
I think it really depends to who you're talking. I think in the industry and policy space, it's a fairly well understood concept, with some areas of it still needing to be clarified, particularly with regards to offsets, for example. But again, going back to my example of buildings, I don't think people relate so much to net zero building, but they do relate to being so-called in their home. And so in this case, for example, for me, when I talk about the policy changes that are needed in this space, it's a lot more effective to talk about the fact that this is about a healthier home and bill savings. And so again, I think we're going back to the narratives into what people relate to. But I think in this particular case, and it's probably true in transport as well, it's a lot more effective to tell to people that this is about a healthier, happier life than a net zero life.
Yeah, I suppose I just wanted to add to that, because sometimes because it's been shortened to net zero rather than just net zero emissions, I think you can link it to, net zero impact. So what we're trying to do is, we're not saying that we can just overnight, we can stop doing what we're doing, but we're actually trying to create new behaviours and new technology to help us change so we can get the most out of our day and enjoy a healthy life with a minimum impact that we can make. So I think there's lots of opportunity in the wording.
A quick follow-up question to Trish. Can you maybe give some examples from your work in the council in how people have responded? Do you use the language of net zero? Do you sort of not use it or try to accommodate it to the particular audience that you're talking to, or is it not an issue that at all, and you just go on and do your climate plan? Now go on to your turn.
I think it is a very popular term. So our councillors love it. They love to think, we're doing net zero. It's very groovy, very now. I don't know if the community has connected with it as much, but it's nice to if we can talk about it in how we've got there. So the fact that we are purchasing 100% renewable electricity, one, we show it's possible. And it gives us also the basis of leading other groups to do the same, or like working with businesses to show how it can be done as well. So I think it's an easy way to identify those actions, because often, it goes back to our normal sustainability messaging, but sometimes that has been, I suppose, used for so long that people interpret it in different ways. So I suppose this is a new way of doing it.
In the interviews I've been doing for the project, I was asking people to talk about what net zero means to them, and maybe not surprisingly, it meant almost something completely different to every person I spoke to, which speaks to the sort of ambiguity of the term. But one thing that stood out was that someone said it should be about rather than what we're losing, what we're gaining. And I think if we talk about net zero in terms of what it enables and what it can augment and what it can bring, rather than look at it through like a deficit sort of thinking lens, it's sort of like, net zero enables healthy lifestyles, better, futures for ourselves and our families and our kids and so on and so forth. Like what are those stories, and go back to stories, what do they look like, and how can we talk about net zero in those positive strength-based kind of terms? I think could be a good idea.
Thanks for that. I'd like to move on to another element of discussion which came up in the conversations. The question online? Yeah. Okay. We'll jump to that.
So we've got a question from a participant online called Paris Hadfield. How might net zero interventions by industry and governments be undertaken more democratically to potentially bridge the divide between bottom-up and top-down change? Are there good examples of this?
That's a very good question from Paris. We know. Thank you, Paris. So yeah, any thoughts on that? And I guess there's a potential tension there between the urgency for pace and scale, some of the things that Margot also emphasized, versus democratic processes and ensuring representation from all the different possible voices and interests in this space. And I guess, Sarah, you also respond a little bit to questions about equality. So yeah, I think there's lots of that to discuss. We would like to
I could go first, but somebody else might like to this time.
That's fine, you can go, Sarah.
Because I think really, if you get it right with the people, you're going to get it right at the other end. And I'm going to talk about this in business context as well. So if you actually gain an appropriate and engaged understanding of the values and the way forward on the ground, then that's what's going to actually feed into success from the top-down approach as well. So I think any meeting point really needs to have an understanding, and this is what I talk about, when I talk about engaging a whole range of very different stakeholders and seeing real people living in their homes or in organizations or communities as being equal stakeholders in a net zero future. So when we go about designing policy and we go about designing urban systems that will work towards net zero, it's really fundamental to gain an understanding of the people who will be living in those systems and participating in them, in designing them. So don't design a system and then expect you're going to change people's behavior and make them fit with what's been predetermined. Don't think you can predict futures quantitatively and then expect real people whose lives are very qualitative to conform to those, but search for the meeting point. So in terms of examples, they're very different in not a different context, a different project, which has some connections with sustainability. We've just launched a report from our work with the City of Melbourne, which is about the use of sensor tech to collect data in the city. And in that project, we wanted to understand how people living in Melbourne experience data, how they felt about privacy, how they thought they might use data, how they thought it might be good for them, not just for them to think about, oh, the city's collecting my data, what are they doing with it, and for the city to learn from it. So working with the City of Melbourne, we aligned values, and for me this is the core thing, is aligning the values. So for net zero, we want to think, what are the values for net zero? For an organisation, policy context. What are the values related to net zero for the research team that's actually creating those connections between the top up and the bottom down? What are our principles and our ethics? And then what are the values on the ground? What is really important to people? And a lot of our work in other projects shows is that what's important to people is that they feel engaged, they feel respected, they feel in control, they feel able to be part of something rather than having something done to them. And that is specifically also in relation to the way that automated tech might be used in working towards futures, be that net zero futures, be that futures that reduce energy demands, or be that the use of data by collection of data by cities, by energy companies, by all kinds of organizations. So create those connections and create the alignments.
So I guess I've got two elements of answers to that. One example I'll provide, which I'm actually not sure if it's been done in Australia, that's from my home country, France. I think a few years back now, the President Macron started the Citizen Assembly for Climate, and they randomly picked 150 citizens that were representative of the population, weren't climate nerds, not like me, and for together, they brought them together, and for a number of weekends across a number of weeks, and it was fully supported by the government. They were briefed. They had a lot of information come to them from NGOs, and I was working in NGO at the time, from researchers, from the IPCC, from the High Climate Council in France. So they really took on a lot of information over a long period of time. The ultimate goal of the process was for them to design, and they were supported in the legislative process of this, was for them to actually design legislative propositions for climate law on a number of areas, including buildings and transport, food, and a bunch of different things. And so they did, and they at the end they put together a book of amendments for positioning to law, and it was very detailed. They were supported by lawyers. Being from a climate NGO at the time, it was incredible what they came up with, from people who had, for a lot of them, no concept whatsoever of climate policy at the beginning. What they came up with was actually a lot more radical and progressive than what all of the NGOs in the room were even asking for, because we were trying to be consensual, or you go for what you can get from the government. So that, I thought, was a really excellent example of very democratic process that really empowered citizens to come up with fantastic ideas. Where the dream ends is that President Macron at the time had committed to taking with no filter the 150 propositions of the citizens with 3 veto exceptions. And a lot of them actually never got through. So that's where the democratic process actually sort of ended, sadly, is that some of those propositions made it into law, but actually a lot less than they had committed to. So that was just an example, which I think some councils have done as well, like those citizens' assembly, as long as the executive power actually delivers on its promise to implement it. That was a really fantastic example. And the last thing I wanted to say for Australia, I think institutionally we've seen, for example, again, in the building area, we've got quite a strong collaboration between the national and the states as in buildings ministers, but local governments aren't at the table for a lot of those discussions. And I think local governments are this excellent bridge in the institutional processes between people and policy at national stage, because they are so much closer to the field and to the lives of people. And so I think one of the things to think about in terms of the systems thinking and the institutions that we have is how can local governments be better integrated at the table of policy? Because for me, in a lot of cases, they're that missing link, and they do so much, but sometimes their voices aren't heard enough, I think.
Can I just respond?
Yes, you can. I was also going to ask Darren to jump in.
I'll just be very quick, and I think that, the case of France you presented was really interesting, but for me, like the glaring kind of mistake was that there was no analytical filter that created a relationship between what all of those citizens wanted. So rather than translating them into possible laws, it would have been much more interesting then to, and this is where the role of academia comes into applied work and comes into policy, to actually create what I would call, and this is why I talk about our understandings of the way we work towards futures being realistic and plausible, to really creating a realistic and plausible understanding of how some of those ideas that the group of is it 90 or 150 people could really be brought about, rather than just presenting them, as possible laws, as possible ways forward. And I think that that's where anthropology plays an important role, sociology and these academic disciplines, which actually have the skills and the analytical ability to be able to understand what's really happening on the ground and what people, the futures that people can imagine, but then to understand how they could actually really be taken forward into as realistic futures. And that for me is that that's the kind of the leap that we need to take to really make something as marvelous as that example, right? To actually make it into something that could really have the impact that it deserved to have.
Add to that, I think also to bring you in the spotlight, Darren, I know you've been doing a lot of research around living labs. You've been actually trying to get people into conversations with local governments. Can you give us some examples of sort of innovation in local governments and getting people into that democratic process and decision making at the local level?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rob. And I guess we should also preface that with saying, in terms of the linkage project, we're sort of getting at that. We're really trying to get at these governance questions and challenges in terms of setting up this living lab at the Monash Clayton campus and the broader precinct, and trying to understand these questions of decision making and ideation and discussion at a polycentric level across different institutions, the university, the major institutions there, the hospital, the CSRO, and so on and so forth, local government, state government. There's different institutions, actors, there's residents, members of the community. So that's what we're hoping to try and work out over the next few years through the Living Lab approach. In terms of how other places have had a go at this, I can look at Bologna in Italy, where they developed this Bologna regulation for the care and regeneration of the urban commons a few years ago, which took a number of years to come into effect, where everyday citizens were trying to repair some furniture at a local park and realized it was illegal to do so. They worked with some academics at the university, this group called LabGov, and so they set up this quintuple helix approach between public, private, community sector, social entrepreneurs and others to develop a really sophisticated sort of process where culminating in this regulation where the local government of Bologna actually enabled citizens to come forward with proposals for how they could support the urban commons and then enter into collaboration agreements with the local government, and they became empowered to then undertake, repair cafes, activate empty shop fronts, create murals, beautify the city, remove graffiti. And to date, there's been over 400 of these urban commons projects in Bologna. Similarly, in Barcelona, they have, when they had a really progressive mayor, Ada Colau, they had this Barcelona in Common program where the community could put forward proposals and really undertake different forms of deliberative democracy and so on. But it's often, requires that context to support an enabling environment where the political structures are happy to support that type of, grassroots community participation to push those sort of reforms through. Otherwise, they can sort of very easily get ignored or fall by the wayside.
Thanks for that. I'm keen to go into the audience to give you some space to ask your question. There's one question from Ariel, Director of the Energy Institute at Monash.
I wasn't going to mention that, but I was from Monash Energy Institute, and it's really exciting to be in an environment for me where there's so many social scientists talking about these things. I tend to be stuck as line myself down with engineers and good scientists and economists, so all that stuff is something that I think is very important, and not just saying that, it's like it's not going to change unless we take into account all these what people actually do in reality. But I've got like 3 questions and I decided that all of the ice just won't. And that's the one that sort of bugs me the most in this whole energy challenge that we have. And that's that there is a physics-based expiry date on action on climate change, right? We can't negotiate with it. You know, we can't, buy ourselves out economically. It's like 8 years to 12 years, or it's kind of, we don't have a chance of, of winning exceeding 2 degrees, or wherever that window of uncertainty is. So what is like, how do we, prioritize? Something Sarah and I are talking about. Where do we put our efforts, and what does that mean for how we think about the term net zero, which I also agree is kind of everybody's name. I like that Sarah thinks it's still useful. I don't know what the term is myself. And yeah, so how do we build in that urgency into our thinking while also acknowledging that people are just going to do what they're going to do anyway, and it's what they always do. Societal changes often come out of left field. For example, it's actually the internet. It's one of the biggest changes of society that we did not expect. Facebook and all the other stuff like that. So, how do we put it all together and take into account the fact that there is an order of priorities here. If we fail the climate change transformation, all the other stuff's going to be almost irrelevant. We're going to have a whole bunch of new societal challenges we've never even imagined before.
Thank you, Ariel. And so the question, I guess, there's lots of it in there again, but what's the role of social sciences and people in enabling to deal with this kind of urgency that Ariel is putting forward? Who wants to go first? Sarah?
I'm always going first. What's the role of social sciences? I think that, this, if you kind of think of this as it in terms of urgency, right? The role of social sciences is to be able to provide the understanding that we need to be able to inform policymakers, lawmakers, government of what they need to do to make it possible for people to engage in programs towards net zero. So what do we really need to do to enable everybody to be able to use an electric vehicle? We need to stop thinking of the user of the electric vehicle as a young guy who commutes to work on his own. He doesn't have to take his kids to school on the way. He doesn't have to leave work and stop charging his car at work in the middle of the day to take one of his kids to the dentist, right? So, imagine the person with the most complex possible life and design for them, right? So imagine that it's a single father with 5 kids and who has a full-time job. That could be your starting point. And then think about all of the sporting activity those kids are going to do, how much sports kit's got to be washed, how he's going to drive them around, where he's going to charge his electric vehicle. And then that might be one way to actually think about how to design for everybody, to enable everybody to participate. Anybody else?
Chris, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think it's very important because even though we talk about legislation as being really important to make change, at the end of the day, people write legislation. So we need to get them on board to be able to thinking in this direction. It's interesting when you talk about EVs and what we do with it. Often people say, oh, we don't want an EV because of range anxiety, where even though most people probably don't travel more than 5Ks, especially at the moment, away from home. So they're usually got pretty close access to energy. So one of the things we're actually trying to do with we're putting in EV chargers is through a grant program, but we're actually putting them in close to 10-minute parking spots. And we're giving people 45 minutes to an hour to charge, because Monash is only, from one end to the other, it's only probably about 15 Ks. It's there for emergencies and it's there for a top up. But you don't need to be constantly, it's not like your phone. Your phone doesn't need to be constantly attached to the wall to be used. You can charge it, when you need it to keep it going. So I think it's just more, we just need to give people confidence about moving forward. I was also thinking with policy or changes that help change behaviour. I suppose one of the most significant ones recently is the increase in petrol. Suddenly EVs are very attractive to people and we can't get enough of them because the prices of petrol has gone up, and that's not something that, in this field we're probably even thinking about you know, as a legislative change, but maybe we need to think a bit broader about what, you know, what is changing those behaviours and how we can influence them.
I'll just add a note. I really heard your question as how do we prioritize? And I think what you're hinting to, Trish, as well is if, I guess, where we can have the quickest wins and probably big scale is where we are doing things that improve people's lives significantly. And what the example that you just mentioned is one. Again, the building standards is another one. Renovation of existing homes is a huge one. This is something that will have a big impact on Australia's carbon footprint and probably even more on the lives of Australians, on health costs and so on. So for me, you know, putting that net zero concept into a big broader context of sustainable development goals maybe, and prioritizing where we can have big impact for climate, but also big impact for people's lives and reducing energy bills and so on. This is where I would start. Yeah.
Can I just say something more about EVs? Because we've done quite a lot of research about how people believe that they'll live with EVs in the near and the far future. And I think what's super interesting, and I'm just trying to complicate some of that a bit, because a lot of people who are going to buy EVs, they're actually going to give their petrol cars to their teenage kids. So you're not actually taking them off the roads. And so that's one of the concerns that I think we kind of need to think about. How do we address some of those questions as well, some of the which kind of go alongside people getting EVs? I think some of the good news is that we've really found that range anxiety doesn't exist beyond the engineering imagination, that people don't want cars because they're worried about range, because when people get EVs, they actually live so comfortable with them locally that they don't worry about range at all. And I think that's a really positive point too. But the other thing that we've found, which is another complicating factor, is that nearly everybody who's participated in our research wants to charge their EV at home overnight. So that kind of also complicates our hope that people will be using solar powered charging stations during the day. And most of them want to be in control of when it's charged rather than letting it happen automatically. So I think that, you know, all the things you're saying, they're right, you know, you're on the right route, but these complicating factors really come into the way that we need to design to make all of those things possible. And I think that's what we find when we start to unpick the everyday and the way that people imagine those futures. And it means that we've got some extra work to do to help those things come about, because if we can achieve what you're proposing, it's really going to help. And I'm sure that we could, right? But how do we also do something about all of the teenagers who are actually going to be getting a car before they would have done otherwise, because like mum or dad have decided that they're going to be super ethical and work towards net zero. So yeah.
Thanks, Sarah. Just quickly responding to Ariel, I think it's also about making net zero visible and tangible. I just don't think it's on most people's radars. And so there's a huge communications challenge there. We can, I guess, maybe be inspired by, you know, how Melbourne Water, others, the Black Balloon campaign, other things are sort of getting net zero on people's radars and understanding. Like some of the early interview feedback we're getting as well from the Linkage project, people in the precincts are sort of saying, I don't know who's responsible for doing what, and I don't know what rebates or incentives and so on is available. Should I go and find this out? Do I talk to the local government, state government? You know, where do I go? What do I do? Who do I talk to? So there's that sort of you know, that kind of confusion that I think needs to be addressed as well. So I think communications, making it visible, tangible. But yeah, it's that speed and scale. It's such an important thing as well.
Thanks for those contributions. And it's a really good question, Ariel. And I just, before I go into this, you know, I've got the next question from you. Just my contribution to this would also be to say that I think there's more work to be done with the social sciences, really, because there's, in a sense, that your question of urgency is super important, but we should at the same time try and prevent that leads to a too early closure of debates, or where all the stuff that we talked about today, like the values, diversity, multiplicity, that gets thrown out of the door as well. So we need to find actually tools and methods that allow to integrate that sort of existing multiplicity to then enable a more urgent transition. because, as you say, the physical basis is there that we can negotiate with them. Got another question from Liz.
Yes, I reluctantly asked the question, but I'm just like, okay. There is a point actually. Well, a lot of the hype around net zero and I guess the kind of technological part is based on electric vehicles. And it seems to me that a lot of the kind of the narrative, even in the best case scenario that we're selling to people, is that you can have the system of automobility that we've created and made you dependent on. You can have it and have it be electric. Could you comment on alternatives for automobility, not requiring a car? And in Sarah's example, the person with 5 children that are driving, what about Japan, where you don't have to go at all? They have their own mobility, ride and walk to school. What's the role for that in the city net zero vision and even in the storytelling? I know that's where that kind of comfortable middle ground where you can sell something people already want, it's more comfortable. It can hit a bit of a roadblock, so to speak, because everyone drives and wants to. If you're trying to tell them actually you might be better placed walking, they'll be like, what, some kind of peasant? You can't sell them that way. And as a sub question, which might be more practical, within that transition, if you are going for electric automobility as the version of net zero, car parking, which is my topic, is one of the main ways you can make that transition, and it's not on the agenda in Australia. How do you embed electric charging as part of
Thanks, Liz, for the question. I'm being a Dutch person originally. I sometimes say I'm coming from the future when it comes to urban mobility. But maybe I'll ask Margot to comment first, given you alluded to the importance of walking and biking, etc.
Yeah. I think again, I might be coming at this with a very top-down perspective, but not Dutch, I'm French, and I lived in Paris for the past 10 years, and I've really witnessed the transformation of Paris from such a car-oriented city to with massive urban highways in the middle, to a much more cycling friendly. It's not yet Amsterdam, but it's pretty good. It's improved massively, and now instead of car highways, you have bike highways. What used to be one of the major car highways is now actually 2 of them or 3 are bike highways with, like, we're not talking about a 1 meter wide cycling lane, we're talking about like 10 meter wide cycling lanes. And the uptake has been enormous. And so I think, again, I'm not a behavioral scientist, but from what I have observed in that situation, the infrastructure and providing safety, and it's not just the cycle lanes, it's also the signage and the traffic lines for bikes. It's that whole environment, and also subsidies to support people repairing their old bikes or getting an e-bike for those who can't get on a normal push bike, have really helped with increasing the uptake. And so I 100% agree with you. EV is not the silver bullet. We do need it because a lot of trips are going to remain on cars and we need those to transition. But I think better infrastructure for public and active transport can drive so much change. And I've really seen it in Paris, and we're seeing it elsewhere in other cities in the COVID era, where we've had like those pop-up bike lanes that have had pretty lasting changes. So I think that infrastructure is going to be quite key, and it's also where I think infrastructure plays with the narrative, because at the moment you're in Australia, it's so car driven. You walk out and the space isn't there for the bikes in a lot of places. As soon as you start having the space and making it visible, people see it more. They feel safer. They say, oh yeah, this is cool actually. And so I think for me, like that place that you allocate to cycling and walking as part of the urban space, making it more visible, is also a way of I guess, triggering more change.
Do you think, I mean, sorry to clarify, it feels like in Australia, we discourse around, and we're going to really make our cities for more space for infrastructure.
Yeah.
I'm not hearing that in your conversation, or maybe it is that. I'm interested in their thoughts.
Yeah, shall I repeat the question for the people online? So the question is, that in Australia, the debate is a lot more around electric vehicles, and that's the future of transport, and particularly addressed to Sarah Salvas over the
Yeah, I think in Australia there's a massive challenge because there is such an embedded car culture here. So in terms of thinking about how, yeah, the future of public transport, you know, and there are also a lot of kind of political actors and terms of investment. We know we're kind of also thinking about, you know, kind of a capitalist economy that is monetized, which is also fed, you know, by a car culture as well. So I think it's kind of, I think here that it's particularly kind of complex situation as regards to the way that the car is actually so much a part of so many lives, and but also because there is such a powerful engineering narrative in terms of how we get to these routes towards net zero and routes towards change in Australia, where it's assumed that technological solutions can solve so-called societal problems, and the electric vehicle is seen as a solution, and the electric vehicle will attract research funding. And so we get this kind of ongoing situation that's perpetuated at all levels. So in that sense, the car it's not just part of everyday life. The electric vehicle is also part of the way that academic research is funded, the way that industry is funded. It's also to do with the road systems as well. So it's so embedded on so many levels. And if we go back to Ariel's points, if there is urgency, where do you try to make the change? Do you try to actually change to a society that doesn't use a car, or do you try to change to a society that uses cars that won't damage the environment? And of course, then all of the other questions around, you know, are electric vehicles really net zero? Because what are they made of? How do they get here? All of the, you know, the actual cost to the environment of every new technological solution we have to a, you know, environmental problem is also, of course, part of that whole equation.
Sorry, it's just still related to that, sorry. Yeah, it's interesting. The conversation does focus a lot on EVs and EV cars, but it's in the case of council, our fleet or EV fleet is fairly small compared to our, I suppose, a large vehicle fleet. We have mowers, we have tractors. You also have the transport industry. You know, it's great when you work from home and you get things delivered. But there's trucks and that are all using diesel and probably something even more, you know, toxic than petrol. And there isn't necessarily, you know, as immediate solutions for that sort of transport, even compared to, you know, EV vehicles, so EV cars. So it's probably, we just need to think probably wider as well in terms of that.
I'm starting to run out of time. Just can we have 4 to 5 minutes? Or yeah, okay, perfect. So we got a couple more questions now. That's always what happens at the end. More questions. We've got one online and we got one in the room. So I suggest we ask them both and then we get another final response to the comments. So we start with the online question.
Yeah, so we've got a few questions online, but obviously we don't have enough time to answer all of them. But this question leads on from a conversation that's already been happening. So an anonymous attendee has said, there was an interesting point made earlier about not falling into the trap of using the same methods to solve the problems of tomorrow. I wonder how much we have realized that the technologies of this net zero future, including EVs and anything with a battery, rely on rare earths and minerals to produce. This means that mining and this colonial obsession with extraction are here to stay. There is much excitement in Australia about the role the Australian exports of this material will play in the world's transition to green tech and the market-driven financial reward for those who get in early. How do the panel feel about this new environment-saving tech being dependent on continuing to degrade the environment through mining?
You had multiple questions, or that's the one you want to ask?
Well, there's that one, and then another one is what insights or changes have come about so far as a result of the project joining Monash Council and Monash University.
We've got one more question in the room. Can you please say who you are?
Hello, everybody. My name is Max Richter. I'm actually much more comfortable with ethnography of everyday life, but my question, I guess, is a top-down one. You know, the obvious difference of Amsterdam and Monash is population density. I often think about the city, there's a history of the quarter-acre block and that whole culture. So we have space and distance issues. And I wonder, as someone in government, how much your decisions are pending on something like the huge suburban rail link, because I imagine it potentially is going to join bikes and trains. It would be wonderful, but it's such a big project and there's so much controversy and it's a long-term planning issue. So I'm just wondering how you work with those sort of things.
Thanks for that question. So we got a couple of questions. Anyone who wants to give a response? Maybe Darren, do you have any thoughts on any of these questions? I want to put you in the spotlight. We need a few more minutes, which we don't have.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, yes, it's good to know that we're still using extractive, logics in terms of and growth, jobs and growth kind of narrative around the future green economy. And of course, it's problematic. And of course, we need to come up with better ideas. And there are lots of different groups around Australia. There's Regen Melbourne, there's New Economy Network Australia, there's all sorts of groups, grassroots group, there's various community energy projects and initiatives, people working on just transitions. So often it's like there's like a surface layer of things that we see in sort of, mainstream media that's out there. But if you kind of look at it, there's actually a lot of depth. So there's like a plethora of alternatives that we can, turn to look for inspiration for the future. That's all. I'll leave it at that and hand it over.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question about the extractivist nature of the way in which we're looking at net zero futures is super important, but also I just take it back to what I said about the concepts. Don't use concepts of social license because they do come from the extractive industries. So it's, the whole thing is riddled with extractivism. And I think that it's to make that radical shift, even if that might be complicated to do in the kind of the time limited kind of aspect of it. We really need to think about a turnaround in the way we're thinking and conceptualizing and practicing the whole thing.
Yeah, I suppose we need to keep in mind when we're talking about net zero that we're wanting to lead towards net zero impact. So we need to work out how we can constantly evolve our technology so we're not just using the same systems to try and change things. The question about the suburban rail loop, I think that it's a very exciting option, but there is lots of challenges because they're trying to rush it. And we're having to deal with those very questions of, okay, they're going to put the rail in, it's going to reduce the number of cars, but then again, how many trees are we going to lose? What, green spaces are we going to lose to be able to manage it? And I suppose a lot of discussion and move towards moving towards that new direction. So it's, I guess we can just always question and keep moving forward. And not just assume, oh, that's the answer for everything. We just got to keep questioning.
I think I'll keep it short, but to that question about extractivism, for me, the answer is less, which is we need to consume less. And I think our society is not familiar with that concept or comfortable with it, but it is, I think, the first thing. And in the hierarchy of decarbonization, is the first thing is energy efficiencies, consume less, and then you electrify and you transition to renewable energies and then you offset. But yeah, it really is that point about consuming as little resources as we can, even if they're cleaner. I'll keep it at that.
Thank you for those responses. And I add to myself as well. I think to the point of extracting rare earths and minerals, I think it's just a really good example that we need to acknowledge that any new technology, any new solution has new benefits, but also new risks and new uncertainties. So we actually don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future. And I think it comes back to Ariel's point in the discussion we had in terms of what is the role of social sciences. And part of the role could be to come up with methods to actually work with those uncertainties and ambiguities and trade-offs and find ways of dealing with that and navigating with those, rather than ignoring them. And I think that's an area of work that I think that we all collectively can do a lot more in. And just a point on Amsterdam, and the bikes, just passionate about this. It's actually not just Amsterdam. You can bike easily in Netherlands, but you can get everywhere in the Netherlands. And it's with public transport and bikes, it's actually the train bike combination, which allows you to get anywhere in the Netherlands without a car if you want to. And I think you were alluding to that point when you said the role of suburban railway. I think that is really critical. And if there would be one advice I could give to the people involved in building the suburban railway, is actually to really think about making sure that it's easy to get to the train stations by bike, to park your bike, to have good, high quality bike parking rather than parking your cars, etc. I think that is crucially important for that. But that's a very specific point I wanted to make. And I think we did reach the end of today's panel. So I just want to thank everyone. Thank you, Carl, for your organization and all of your colleagues for the hard work to make sure everything was managed online well. Also would like to thank all the contributors here, Margot, Trish, Sarah and Darren, and obviously all yourself in the audience here as well as online. Thank you for coming and discussing this with us, and feel free to reach out to any of us to further think and talk about these topics. Thank you very much.